It is for me a personal and particular pleasure to introduce a distinguished University of Pennsylvania colleague and friend, Victor Mair, Professor of Chinese Language and Literature at Penn, and Adjunct Professor at Hangzhou University. Victor was trained in Sanskrit, Chinese, and Hindi, among other languages, and has made seminal contributions in several East Asian subjects. He has studied and translated ancient texts and led the campaign to compile an alphabetical index for the most comprehensive Chinese dictionary. Victor has written or edited more than 24 books, including Contact and Exchange in the Ancient World, which may be relevant tonight, and the Columbia History of Chinese Literature. He has translated several indispensable ancient texts and published more than 100 articles and over 300 reviews. He is the editor of Sino-Platonic Papers and the founding editor of the series Encounters with Asia at the University of Pennsylvania Press. Victor's translations have become standard. Let me mention only Wandering on the Way, Early Taoist Tales, and Parables of Zhuangzi. How did I do?
Pretty good.
Victor for years has been trying to teach me how to pronounce these, without much success, which I read at his prompting some years ago. Here are anecdotes and tales and fragments that teach us, as he says in the preface, about the usefulness of uselessness, the insignificance of the difference between big and little, and the ironic consequences of good intentions. And here we meet a genuinely weird cast of characters with names like Lickety and Split and Wonton. Victor's latest book, featured in the current issue of Penn's Alumni magazine, is The True Story of Tea. I urge you to read it. Your relationship with this universal beverage will be permanently changed, and for the better. In the past 10 years or so, Victor has come to the attention of the larger public through the astonishing discoveries he made in the back room of a provincial museum in remote Xinjiang. He recognized the profound and disruptive meaning of a group of Western-looking mummies, some of them thousands of years old. The story they tell has been captured on several television documentaries. Victor is probably the only speaker we have had in the 10-plus years of the Penn Humanities Forum whom you can find on YouTube riding a camel through the northern Chinese desert. Victor's subject this evening is the East Asian Heartland and its Bronze Age connections. Welcome.
Got to turn on my mic just a moment. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Peter. And I also want to thank Wendy Steiner for inviting me to deliver this lecture. And one other person I'd like to thank is Julie Charbonnier, who helped me put together the PowerPoint slide because I'm totally incapable of doing that myself. So thank you, Julie. Have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to get going right away. And I'll go through these slides. Now, as humanists, when we confront the past, or indeed the present, we rely on images, texts, and objects. And here we have two very curious images, which are objects that are supposedly archaeologically recovered, and they have a text on them. However, we have to be very careful when we look at objects and texts and images, because they may be deceiving us. These two figures were sent to me about a couple months ago by a Penn alumnus who asked me what I thought of them. And I had to tell him they're forgeries, they're fakes, because they're just a mishmash of motifs. Now, if you buy something like this in China, it's almost certain that it's going to be a forgery. And you will be offered things like this for very high prices. Don't buy them, because it's against the law. And so therefore, anything that people are going to offer to you in China of this nature is suspect. Now, if you go to Hong Kong, that's a different story. you'll probably be getting genuine stuff, but you won't know where it came from. It's unprovenienced if it's in Hong Kong, because it was looted and sent down there for sale. It'll be real, probably. So be wary of the evidence. But then you can use evidence to point out that something is a fake or forgery. I mean, there are my reasons for determining that these are forged is that they're just sui generis. People didn't make images like this regularly in China, so they're interesting, but not authentic. On the other hand, we have here a map that is based on empirical evidence, gathering together data about climate patterns and vegetation. So this is something we can believe in. These fellows, you can put them around in your knick-knack collection, but you can't believe in them. Now, this is one of my favorite maps, and I don't know what you see when you look at this map, but the first thing I see is this. That's called the Taran Basin. And in the middle of the Taran Basin sits the Taklamakan Desert, which is one of the meanest, biggest, coldest, hottest deserts on Earth. It just happens also to be where the mummies were found. So they were found around these areas, around the rim. You know, there are oases that people lived in there. So the desert itself is very, very hot and cold in the winter, 40 degrees below centigrade in winter, 40 degrees above in summer. But you can survive in oases around the edge. And one of the sites I'll be talking about tonight is right there. It's out in the middle of the desert. And another site is over there, also out in the middle of the desert. Okay, that's the first place I see when I look at this map. It's like an eye in the center of Asia that just draws me in. And then the next place I see is this. That is the Ordos. And what you see here is the Yellow River going up, around, and down. This is a very strange geological feature. What has happened is that the Yellow River, which you would think would just flow right down to the ocean, has somehow gotten a quirky idea to go up and capture a part of the steppe. And in Chinese, they use the word bow, he tao, you know, like the great bow or the great lasso that lassoed a part of the steppe and brought it in to China. I'll be talking a lot about that part tonight. Now the Ordos, actually, it's the source of our name horde, like golden horde. And the Polish got this word and stuck the H on it at the beginning. So it's you all know what a horde is, but it came from this place. It's a contested ground between the settled and the nomadic and the pastoral, the steppe peoples. Very important place in Eurasia. So this is a slide of the edge of the desert. This is actually in the area of Turpan, which is the second lowest place on Earth after the Dead Sea. And it's extremely hot because it's so low. It's like an oven in the summer. These mountains are called the Flaming Mountains. And if any of you have ever read the famous Chinese novel, The Journey to the West, the pilgrim, Xuanzang, talks about these. In certain times of day, certain atmospheric conditions, it looks like there are flames flying up off of these mountains. So they're called Flaming Mountains. And now I'm going to take you on a trip. So fasten your seat belts. It's going to take about 2 minutes. And I have to tell you how I came upon this trip. Toward the end of last year, somebody sent me a link to this YouTube video. I wasn't in it. It was a video made by the American Museum of Natural History, and it was a trip through the universe in 6.5 minutes. And I'm going to show you a couple minutes, maybe a minute and a half, not to take up too much of the time, but it's well worth it. And I hope that you'll like it so much that you'll find it yourself, or I can tell you the URL, and you go look for it. You're going up over Tibet. Okay, what you see here, you see my arrow? Yes. That's the Taran Basin, Taklamakan Desert. This is Tibet down here. And over here is that Ordos. So you can see they're both along the same range, latitude, more or less. And so there's the Ordos. The two key points of my vision when I look at Eurasia. So we'll go up higher into the sky. We'll start moving faster soon. We'll fly through space. Hold on. One second. Okay, see all those stars in the background? The nebulae. These are like electrons around nuclei. Zodiacs. Now he goes fast. Okay, so you go all the way to the edge of the universe. Now we're going to get us back down to Earth. I didn't take you all the way to the edge. It take too long. Okay, now you see the Himalayas there. And now we're going to come right back down beside the Taran Basin. There we are. So even the American Museum of Natural History knew how important that is. I got to get the right key here. Escape. Okay, there. Now. Good. I'm back to where I wanted to be. Back in the Taran Basin. So, now this is not to show my face. This is to show that poster. It says Bronze and Iron Age Mummies of Eastern Central Asia. In this very auditorium, on the weekend of April 19th to 21st, 1996, we had a major international conference about the mummies and their cultures. And I think it was a transformative event because it changed the way we look at the Eurasian history, the development of civilization in Eurasia. And that guy I call David, because he looks like my second eldest brother, spitting image. Now, I want to give you some good news. That is, so I started working on the mummies in essentially 1991, took my first expedition in 1993, had this conference, and I took a number of expeditions, and I had this conference in 1996. So essentially, the whole of the 1990s, I was working really hard on the mummies. And I just want to tell you that on February 5th, 2011, the mummies will be opening in a show here in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. That's great news. It's almost unthinkable that it's going to happen. And I do hope that it's sort of a rebirth of this museum, that it will revitalize the museum, and getting tremendous help from everybody here in making it happen. Okay, so why I took you through the universe, now I'm going to take you down the other direction, into molecules. So when I look at these, I have to tell you why I decided to put slides like this in my lecture today. A couple weeks ago, I was riding the train back home, the same one that Pat McGovern rides when he goes out to media. I go out to Swarthmore. And sitting in front of me, I mean, you can learn so much anywhere, even on the train. Sitting in front of me was a woman with a computer. And I was just fascinated by what she was doing. She was traveling through molecules on her computer screen. I mean, she could navigate through molecules. And it looked like it was really fun. And I watched it for a long time. And then I thought maybe she was going through space. But then finally I said to her, what are you doing? And she says, I'm a molecular physicist. And I was so impressed because she would go through the molecules and look at certain atoms, and then she would put a little notation in there. And what I was seeing is the tremendous connectivity that was present in those very small particles. Just as there's tremendous connectivity in the universe, which is made up of infinite number of celestial bodies. So when I look at this, I feel like I'm also looking into the universe, even though actually I'm looking at a very, very small object. Now, in Indian Buddhist philosophy, there's something called Indras Net. And the idea is that there are many, many nodes, each with a gem or a reflecting surface, circular surface, in which you can see all the other, in which are reflected all the other nodes. Now imagine if you were going up to our rotunda here in the museum and you looked into the crystal ball. How many of you have done that? Okay, if you look in that crystal ball, you can see everything else in the rotunda. Now imagine that rotunda is full of such crystal balls. And that you look in one, and then from that one you look in all the others, and so they're all interpenetrating. This is the idea of Indras Net, a Buddhist philosophical concept that tries to explain metaphorically how everything is interrelated. That's certainly the way I look at China. You know, it used to be that people thought China was cut off from the rest of the world. But I see it as very much tied up with the rest of the world from the very beginning. And how did it happen? This is the slide I had on the title page. If you look here, this is, it says, step, where's the step? Yeah, right there. Temperate grassland, prairie, or steppe. So what happens, I mean, they didn't mark in Europe that's the Urals, what the kind of vegetation is there. But it extends over. This is the steppe. And so you can see, the main point I want to make is that following the steppe, you can go all the way down into the East Asian Heartland, which is here. It's just like an invitation to go into, because people were following the grasslands. And the reason the Chinese built a Great Wall across the Ordos was to try to keep people from spilling down from the grasslands into the heartland. You can see it more clearly here, that going all the way from the Carpathian Mountains all the way across, and then it doesn't show it going down into China, but it does. On the other map, you could see that. So there's the Ordos again, the Great Bend in the Yellow River. So this is the kind of wall that the Chinese built to try to keep people out, the Great Wall. And I don't think he's here tonight, but one of my colleagues, Arthur Waldron, is the great authority and wrote a marvelous book about the Great Wall, which actually shows that it's not so great. I mean, you know, that it wasn't one single wall that looked like that. I mean, it's a classic work, Arthur Waldron's book on the Great Wall. But it was really, you know, it looks impressive, but you have to remember this is all reconstructed now. And it's based, I'll show you later, on a Ming Wall, which had completely dilapidated. If you, as I have done, I walk to the end of these things, and then you just see that it turns into rubble and ruin. This is all rebuilt. So it didn't work. It didn't keep people out. They got around it. They got over it. Well, now the Chinese have built a Great Firewall, and it's not working either. And the Great Firewall is for cybernetic purposes. And particularly, they have put a big wall around the Taran Basin because of events that took place there last year in July 5th. See, now this doesn't work because people will get over it somehow, or around it, or under it. So it's ineffectual, just like the original Great Wall was. This is the Ming Wall. You can see it just sort of peters out over here. And it's not one continuous stretch. They built sections. And this is the part going across. Here is the Yellow River, and there's trying to cut off flow of people this way. And this is the Great Wall through history. You can see the timeline down here. These are the earliest sections, the yellow. That goes back to like 2nd, 3rd, 4th century BC. And the person who really linked up those early little bits of walls was the first emperor of the Qin. I'm sure that everybody here has heard of the Terracotta Warriors. I'll be talking about them again later in a moment. But now, one thing is very curious. You see these purple sections, they were built. And it's interesting that the sections that are farthest north were built by people who had come from the north. So they got in, and then they tried to shut the door to other people after them. These were the Jurchens and the Khitans. And you can see how far out. I mean, their homelands were up here. So after they got down in, they just said, we're going to build a wall to try to keep people out. Now, a couple days ago, we had news of in the Library of Congress, the Matteo Richie map was put on display. Matteo Richie is one of my great heroes of all time, because he was the person who invented Romanization for Chinese, which I think is a monumental achievement. But he did so much else, and he's responsible for making this map. He was a Jesuit priest who was a missionary in China, and he became extremely learned as a Confucian, in Confucian learning. And he presented this map to the Chinese emperor. And of course, the Chinese emperor was very flattered because China was put in the middle, where its name means that, Zhongguo, the Central Kingdom. Now, I have only seen, this just came out a few days ago in the newspapers, and I've only seen 3 photographs of details of this map. But would you believe they were kind enough to put the Ordos in? I just almost fell off my chair when I saw that this was one of the 3. I mean, they could have chosen anything. They just gave me what I wanted. And there's the Great Wall. And it says Hetao, which is the great bend in the river. And there's the Central Kingdom. And it says the Central Kingdom's prefectural names cannot be translated. So that was a real thrill to see this map, which is going to end up in Minnesota, but it's on temporary display in the Library of Congress right now. So I'm going to start going back in time, because I promised you I'd be talking about the Bronze Age. So I showed you the Ming Wall, and I'm going to make a case that China was not, and never has been separated from the rest of the world, Eurasia in particular, and that Great Wall doesn't mean anything. So I'm going to start telling you how we know that China, the East Asian Heartland, was not cut off from the rest of the world. So this, everybody knows about the Silk Road. Very famous. It actually extended all the way over to the coast, but Xi'an, some of you have been there, I'm sure. And it went out through the Gansu corridor, and there's our Taklamakan Desert in the Taran Basin. And, okay, so the Silk Road was operative from, let's just say, 138 BC, when Han Wudi sent Zhang Qian off to link up with the Yuezhi people to try to fight against the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu, that's really, Hunnu is the same word as Huns. So the Silk Road was opened up by a Han emperor in 138 BC. And you can see how elaborate it is, and huge amounts of trades were going on there, going across all the way to Rome, and then down into India and across the steppe also. So everybody knows this, and we have so much evidence. We have figurines from Chinese tombs in the Tang Dynasty that are clearly foreign, and lots of objects from abroad. So nobody would deny that China was very open during the time of the Silk Road, say from the 2nd century BC to 13th or 14th century AD. And then we all know that Buddhism came from India and went to the East Asian Heartland, and it also went by sea. This is a very schematic map. But we all know that Buddhism is in China and it came from somewhere else. And even though there were periodic proscriptions, persecutions of Buddhism in China, it's now, even now, it's still a very important religion, a very major cultural force in China, and it came from India. So obviously, even the Himalayas and the desert couldn't stop Buddhism from, or the ocean couldn't stop Buddhism from coming to China. This is even before the Silk Road opened. This is one of the major factors in the transmission of culture from the west to the east. What can I say? This young man, Alexander, he died a young man. He accomplished so much. And a couple weeks ago, I was in Germany at a museum in the town of Mannheim, a very nice museum called the Rice Engelhorn Museum. And there's a wonderful exhibition, it's still there now, about Alexander the Great and how his moving around in the world mixed cultures. You know, he intentionally married Iranian woman named Roxana. And so this was because he wanted people to come together. Now, at that museum, there was a spectacular video, just as spectacular as this American Museum of Natural History video, where it followed in a couple of minutes, well, about 3 or 4 minutes, it followed Alexander everywhere he was going. It was incredible. You think this man was manic because he was racing, and he had a whole army with him. And I thought, this guy, what is he doing? You know, goes off here, goes here, up into Central Asia, and then comes back here. And when you see this at the museum in the video, it's just, the line is like that. Then I looked at a map of the Achaemenid Empire, and it became clear to me that what he was doing, he was going everywhere the Achaemenid Empire had been. He was just kicking them out because he had a big gripe against them, because the Achaemenids had extended their sway all the way to Macedonia, where he's from. So he just said, I'm going to go and kick their behinds, get them out. And everywhere you see he went, that's where the Achaemenid Empire was. That's my own interpretation. Otherwise, I have no real explanation for why he was racing around like that. Well, he wanted to conquer the world, sure. But I think more than that, he wanted to get back at the Achaemenids, the Persians. So as he went, you know, he spread Greek culture. And that's why we have Hellenic culture up here in Bactria. Right there's the Taran Basin. Okay? You just go over these Tian Shan and the Pamirs, and you're in the back door of the East Asian Heartland. And so we have texts in Bactrian that are written with the Greek script, but they're actually Iranian. They're Iranian texts written with Greek script. And that's because of Alexander moving around. Now, I don't like to look at that, but it's a marvelous statue. This is from the tomb of the first emperor that I talked about. The first emperor of the Qin, the Terracotta Warriors. Now you just look at the legs. And why is this supposedly East Asian figure wearing a Greek kilt? He's an athlete, an acrobat of some sort. But there are also other figures from the very enigmatic figures from the tomb of the first emperor that look Greek, like wrestlers, for example. A few scholars, art historians, have started to work on this. One is Richard Barnhart, a professor emeritus from Yale University, and one is a young professor at SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies. Actually, he's a German, Luke Nichols, I think, or maybe a Swiss. They're starting to look at comparisons of statues from the tomb of the first emperor of the Qin and comparing them to statues from Greece. This is a horse from Mausolus, the tomb of King Mausolus, the famous mausoleum. That's where we get our word mausoleum. And this is one of the 7 wonders of ancient history, 7 wonders of the world, that tomb. And you can go, if you want to see what it looks like a little bit, go to see Grant's tomb in New York. Because there are so many buildings around the world that are modeled after Mausolus's tomb. So there's a horse from that tomb, and here's a horse from the tomb of the first emperor of the Qin. So there, I think eventually people will start to draw more parallels and look very closely at, how out of nowhere this tradition of life-size statuary came to be around the end of the 3rd century BC in China. This is from Persepolis, which is which was the capital of the Achaemenids. I'll go back to there. It's right there. And this man is, what do you think he's doing? He's sniffing. He's smelling incense. The incense is coming up off these, they're like hill incense burners. They're called hill incense burners. And so I think he's sniffing the aroma. And this is about, let's just say 6th century, early 6th century BC. Now we find in Gandara, which is like Pakistan, in the area around Pakistan, we find the same kind of censer, but later, 1st century AD, 1st century, you have them around that, 1st century AD, BC. And then they went the other way too, to Anatolia. That's another Anatolian one. But this is from China. In China, they were called Boshan Lu, hill censers. So, I mean, there's several scholars, Martha Carter, for example, have written about this and have traced the transmission of this type of censer from the west to the east. Okay, now moving back in time. I mean, that was like from the 6th century to the 3rd century AD. We have this kind of censer. This is actually a tiny thing. This is a bead. It's called an eye bead. It's a very peculiar thing. I don't think it could be independently invented twice in 2 different places that are separated. But this kind of bead was popular in Phoenicia. So, and that would have been, say, like 9th, 10th century BC already, and even extending later, of course. But this bead is from China, and we have such beads from all over China, from all over East Asia. The East Asian Heartland and the extended East Asian Heartland, we have these eye beads from the 8th, 7th, 6th century BC. Now, how they got there, that's a question. But they did. This is a very peculiar type of bead that could not have been independently invented in 2 different places. And yet we have thousands of these beads from China in 6th, 5th, 4th century, all over. Now, it's very interesting that even though it's a peculiar kind of bead, the the people in East Asia learned how to make it with local materials because the chemical content shows that it was made locally, except for a few that would have been imports. Oh, I should mention, something very interesting happened to me this morning. It was very serendipitous. Last night in the museum, there was a lecture by a woman named Adrian Mair. She has recently written a book called Mithridates, the Poison King. Mithridates, that's a Persian-based word. It means gift of Mithra. She was here yesterday, and she's a friend of mine, so I couldn't go to her talk, so I said I'd go down to the city and meet her at her hotel this morning for breakfast, and I did. I came up out of the suburban station, and there are many exits to the suburban station. I could have exited from any number of places and gone to Embassy Suites Hotel to see her. As it so happens, I turned the corner and I looked up and I saw the Comcast building. And I said, oh my, I want to go in there because I've heard they have a spectacular lobby. And my wife told me that there's a beautiful display in the Comcast building. So in Ohio, Midwesterners say, follow your nose. I followed my nose and went into that tower, and then I saw on the back wall this incredible display of, I don't know how many of you have been there, but it's worth a trip. It's got 5,700 video panels. You don't really know what it is. It looks like the wall is alive, like a huge screen, but it's 10 million pixels. And so it just keeps showing things all day long. And a couple of things I saw there while I was watching were number one, a scene of space, which was very much like what I showed you. I thought that was very nice. And it's all moving, of course. But then something that really made me almost fall over was it had a bunch of purple beads all over the screen, flying all over this huge wall, and the beads were just like similar to these, which was showing like, oh my goodness, these beads are like atoms or molecules that are linking up everything. Now, beads are probably the earliest form of human decoration and communication. We have beads as early as 100,000 years ago. And at 24,000 years ago, at a site called Sungir, in 200 miles east of Moscow, before you get to the Urals, we have a burial of an old man and two boys. The boys are like 7 to 9 years old, and the other one is like 10 to 12 years old. And each boy has on him 3,500 beads made from mammoth ivory. This is 24,000 BC. Now, these beads are across the forehead, over the chest, down the legs, around the ankles. And each bead probably took 45 minutes to make. So for each of those little boys, they invested probably 2,625 hours of work, beadwork. This shows how much they thought of those little boys 24,000 years ago. And that they expressed their love through placing beads on these little boys' bodies. So, being in the Comcast with the beads flying around on that screen and then showing you this, something so tiny as a bead can have enormous meaning and implications, especially when multiplied by thousands. So the people in East Asia, this is a bronze object, a mirror, but they used the eye beads as though they were gems, and they inlaid them. There are many, many objects from East Asia that have, ancient East Asia, that have using these eye beads as gems for inlay. Moving back in time, well, this is actually from about, it has to date from before 386 BC. This is a tomb in Shandong. Now, Shandong is where Confucius came from. And it's not a place where you would expect to find horses. And yet, we have 600 horses here in this burial, 200 meters long. It would be the equivalent of burying 600 Jaguars or Mercedes-Benzes in your grave. This guy was trying to make a statement, a local ruler. I mean, because you had to import them. And where did they get them? They got them from the steppe. Horses were domesticated in the northern steppe area. They weren't domesticated in China, and the use of horses for riding and traction comes from along the steppe and down into China. But still, the fact that some ruler in Confucius's homeland wanted to bury all these horses means that the horse meant a lot to these settled people, even though it wasn't native to that area. And then going back still further, so the horse was brought into China probably around 1200 BC, maybe even a little earlier, but primarily for chariot traction first, much before riding. But in the second millennium BC, we start to get metallurgy, bronze metallurgy, spreading across the steppe. And this, the editor of this is a brand new book. It's 2010. The main editor is Zhenjun Mei, and I mention him in particular because at that 1996 meeting in this room, he was a graduate student from China, and he gave a paper, and he now has become the preeminent historian of metallurgy in China. Still young. But what this book reveals to us, these are the latest studies on the transmission of bronze metallurgy across Eurasia. And it shows very clearly that bronze metallurgy was moving across the steppe. And I believe that this is one of the main reasons why people wanted to keep going toward the east, because they were looking for ore sources. I mean, there's a Russian scholar named Eugene Chernik who has documented this very well. And we have here in the museum two researchers, Joyce White and Elizabeth Are Joyce and Elizabeth here? I don't know. Huh?
They're still in Laos.
Excuse me?
They're working in Laos right now.
Oh, they're in Laos. That's why they're not here. Anyway, Joyce and Elizabeth have recently written a major paper in the Journal of World Prehistory that, that's all right, I like musical accompaniment. Now, you see they're in Laos now, but Joyce is a specialist on Thai archaeology. And they've written a major paper which shows how all the way down to Thailand, if you want to trace how the bronze got down to Thailand, it came across the steppes. There's a long tradition of, well, I won't say long, it started in the 80s approximately, of trying to trace how bronze got across Eurasia. And a lot of it took place in this room or at Penn. A great scholar, an old colleague of mine named James Muley in ancient history. Keep it going. Yeah. James Muley, back in the 80s, I think, started to show how bronze came across from west to east. And then there's a great Chinese scholar named An Zhimin, one of the greatest archaeologists in China, who's passed away now. But in 1993, he published a major article reconsidering the sources of bronze in early China. And he delivered that paper here in this auditorium too. And then the last paper of the great British archaeologist, a posthumous paper, kill it now. The last paper, a posthumous paper of Andrew Sherratt, was about what he called the Trans-Eurasian Express. And it is in that book that Peter Kahn mentioned, Contact and Exchange. That's Andrew Sherratt's last paper. And the Trans-Eurasian Express was about bronze technology moving across. And then we have scholars like Louisa Fitzgerald Huber, who study long-distance contacts between Chinese civilizations in the northwestern part of the East Asian Heartland, in places as far west as the Urals, Sema Turbino, for example, the civilization there. So this work on bronze metallurgy coming from the west to the east it's now, I would say, more or less accepted, even in China. Okay, so if people are moving around and technologies are moving around, then animals are probably moving around too. And indeed, the sheep was from Western Eurasia, from the Southwest Asia. It was domesticated first. And so the domestication of sheep also was something that was introduced from the West. And so was wheat, for example. So this is, you can see that the character for sheep has two horns. This is the modern form. And this is the auricle bone forms, about 1,200 BC. And these are bronze forms, say, first half of the first millennium BC. So these are earlier. I call them avocaprids because they're the same word for sheep and goat. So if you want to say goat or sheep, you have to use the compound. Now, what's very, very interesting is that the sheep or goat, the avocaprid graph, gets in all of these terms, such as beauty. Now, you have to remember that sheep and goats are pastoral. They came along from the steppe. They're not local to the settled people of the Yellow River Valley, the East Asian Heartland. These are imports, the idea of sheep and goat raising, pastoralism. So these are basic concepts that we still use in Chinese now. Beauty, raise or nurture. You can see the goat here, the sheep goat here and here. Shame, embarrassment. And something so important as righteousness or justice has the sheep-goat radical there. Goodness, auspiciousness. This is the name of an important surname. It has the sheep-goat radical on the top. This means guide to goodness. Whoops. Guide to goodness. Admire. Shen. And this is very interesting. Stressed very heavily by a Chinese philosopher named Xunzi in the 3rd century BC. in its chin. You can see the sheep goat there. And that's the phonetic, jun, but it also has a secondary semantic quality of leader. So it's to form a group or a community. And Xunzi talks a lot about how this makes human beings more important and more capable than even powerful beasts because they know how to form communities. But look, to form communities means like make a flock, to form a flock. It's a metaphor from animal husbandry. Other linguistic evidence of contact with the West. I wrote an article about this in 1990. I'll be fast because the article is very long, and I'm going to summarize it in like 1 minute. These figurines are made of clamshell. You're going to see that they're obviously Caucasoid. They were found in the royal precincts of the Zhou Palace dating to 800 BC. Now, on the top of this man's cap is this thing, which we know that is the cross potent, and it's also the sign of magicians in the West through late antiquity to modern times. Aleister Crowley still had those things. Now, you can't see it, but in modern Chinese, this character transforms into this, Wu, which means people usually translate it as shaman. It did become a shaman essentially later. I don't want to go into the Tungusic meaning of shaman or what a shaman really is, but that's the modern pronunciation, Wu. An old Sinitic pronunciation, it would be something like Mag or Myag, which I'm sure it's the same word as magician, Magush, which the Magi. These were the Magi who went to see the baby Jesus. And I just heard from Adrienne Meyer this morning at breakfast. See, it was so nice that I went down there to see her because she also told me that Mithridates, oh my, another accompaniment. Mithridates also had the Magi come visit him when he was born. 100 years before Jesus. Iranian Magi, the Magi are Iranian. That's an Iranian word. It's not in other Indo-European language groups. It's strictly in the Iranian branch. So whenever you see Magi, you think Iranians, okay? Please. And so I think we have Iranians here at the Zhou Dynasty court, Magi, at 800 BC. Nobody has ever rebutted my article. It's been out since 1990. And it's been translated into Chinese, too. Okay, so astronomical lore also came across. I'm not going to go into it deeply, but you can see here that by lining up stars, you can form things that have conceptual meaning. Of course, this is Zhong, center. But then these things you can find, I wasn't able to get a slide that shows how these patterns are reproduced on bronze vessels. So the astronomical lore was also something that tied West and East together. And it's very nice to think that people are looking up into space and getting inspiration for their concepts here on Earth. And that the same sky is pretty much everywhere in the northern hemisphere, right? So that's going to link you up. If you're looking at the sky in China, or if you're looking at the sky in Mesopotamia, whether or not you exchange your ideas, you're going to be receiving similar kind of source of information. More linguistics. This is for Mark Lieberman. Any people who speak Swedish here? Any Swedish speakers? Well, anyway, I'll try my best. This is a scene from outside of Uppsala, the great university town of Uppsala. These are Uppsala University students. It's the very fine old university. And they are drinking mjöd. Mjöd. Okay? This is the late 19th century photograph. Now, they're drinking out of these horns, right ones. Now, mjöd is the same word as in English mead. Mead. It's honey. How would you call it, Pat? Honey what?
Wine.
Honey wine. Okay. So now, this word mjöd or mead, the Chinese word for honey is mi in modern Chinese. But in Old Chinese, Old Sinitic, which we've known for over 100 years, it is miet. In Old Sinitic, miet. And this word in Tocharian, which is one of the oldest Indo-European languages, which also just happens to be the Indo-European language that got farthest east, and can be attested farthest east. It was in the Taran Basin. So that the Tocharian word for honey and the Old Sinitic word for honey are virtually identical. And now you can see how fast things move. This is for Tad Sure. These are, it says just published. Actually, they're not yet published. They're online just two or three, a few days ago. I happen to be one of the authors of this one. There are lots of authors. These are Koreans and Mongolians. And this is based on ancient DNA, this study. I mentioned the Xiongnu earlier in my lecture. The people, their name essentially is the same as the word Hun. This article is based on modern DNA. And this is from out in a village out in the desert right now, of people who are called Uyghurs, but they're obviously carrying blood from earlier populations. So I just wanted to show you this to say that genetics is also a source of information showing how people moved around on the Eurasian continent. Language, genetics, gems, beads. Okay, now when we have our mummies show here, we will have, I believe, one of these posts. This is actually a very highly sexually symbolic post. I won't reveal the answer right now. You can think about it until February 5th, 2011. But this is from a cemetery that dates to about 1,800 BC. And this is a very new discovery. It hasn't been published yet. The point I want to make is that this site is called the Northern Cemetery, and it's actually in the southwestern part of the Taran Basin. It's 650, almost 700 kilometers distant from another site in the northeastern part of the Taran Basin that has the identical culture. And that's 1,800 BC. I mean, this just was discovered within the last year or two. Hasn't been published or studied. But still, I mean, there were, well, what did they look like? Blonde hair, big nose, deep-set eyes. And now I'm going to talk about these hats a little bit. I'm going to leave some time for discussion, but these hats really intrigue me. These hats are 1,800 BC. Made from felt. Cords wrapped around it. Some of them have feathers along the side. This is the marten. Very extravagant. Peaked, felt. You know, felt is a steppe product. It comes from sheep and goat. Sheep, primarily. It's a steppe product. The first time we find felt in the world is 2600 BC in Anatolia, eastern Anatolia. And it's obviously coming at a place called Besi Sultan. It's obviously coming off the steppes, just as it would be coming off the steppes and getting down into the Taran Basin at these sites. One is called Shalha, Ordos Necropolis. We will have a spectacular mummy from that site. So there are so many of these hats. I love them, and they're all different. They're different colors, different kind of cords wrapped around them. This is really extravagant. You can see well. This is from my father's hometown in Pfaffenhofen, Austria. You can pass it around. And now, these hats, black felt hats, come from central China. And I'm so intrigued by these hats. They come from the hometown of China's greatest writer of the 20th century, Lu Xun, Shaoxing. And I saw them once in a movie, and I just flipped out. I said, what are felt hats like this doing in South China, in Zhejiang? So I made a special trip, and I bought one. Okay. I mean, why are these guys in South China doing this? I have made so many efforts to try to find out when this kind of hat was first made in South China. I don't know. It's one of these mysteries. Now, this is the last slide. This is called the Hami fragment, the Hami textile. It's a plaid. It's a diagonal twill, definitely a plaid. It's 1200 BC from Kumul, Kizilchoka. And I was very fortunate because the Chinese archaeologists took it out of the grave and stuffed it in my pocket. I did not take it. I swear to you. Cross my heart, hope to die. He literally stuffed it in my pocket and he said, Victor, take this back to America and do every possible test you can. And I gave it to Irene Good, who got her PhD from this anthropology department here. And she did electron microscopy. She did radioactive carbon dating. And so with this little, it's only this big. With that little piece of cloth, she found out so much about textile technology and also about the kind of goats, the kind of sheep from which this wool came, because she looked at the scales, the twists, everything. So it's in Antiquity Journal, her paper. Okay, I just want to say that Elizabeth Barber, the colleague I took with me, and Irene Good, one time, 1995, she wrote a book. One of her first books was called Women's Work, the First 20,000 Years. And it was about weaving technology. Okay. We have textiles from 20,000 years ago and earlier. And the whole notion of what a textile is, the fabric, it starts out with nets. And I'm thinking of reticular arrays. How everything is in a textile it's a web, it's a net. And that's the image we use for the internet too, right? Internet, World Wide Web, we're all linked up. And friends, colleagues, and students, there's something that doesn't love a wall. That the web transcends the wall. And I was thinking as I was in that Comcast building, Comcast is all about communication. I'm not making an advertisement for Comcast, but it's about communication. And it's very high. It can soar over the wall. I mean, the web, Indras Net, covers everything. And we're all part of it. Thank you.